Hi guys, what if I told you that some of my favourite photographs, images that I'm genuinely proud of, were taken without me even looking through the viewfinder of my camera? That right there, well, that's called shooting from the hip. Now, as most of you know who follow this channel, Nina and I haven't actually even hit the road yet. The house is still up for sale, the motorhome still to be bought, and we're still very much in the planning stages of this big late life adventure. Now, while I'm waiting for this next chapter to begin, I want to share everything that I know about street photography, so that when we do finally roll out of Scotland and point that motorhome south, you'll be ready to come with us properly. And today is going to be a wee deep dive into what we would call shooting from the hip. It's actually one of my favourite genres. Admittedly, it's not for everyone, but if you give it a bash, trust me here, it will change your life. Now it's interesting because most non-photographers will instinctively head for the famous cathedral and the tourist sites and, you know, probably take more of a picture postcard type of shot, but trust me here, the actual soul of the place is way better recorded in the faces, the details, and in the light. So I'm going to show you how to get the very best from your photography while you're out on the road. So let's get into it. So what is hip shooting and why do I do it? Well, if you've watched the first video in this series, which I called Street Level Observations, you'll know that I talk about my three distinct styles of street photography: observational photography, hip shooting, and street portraiture. Now, the last time we covered the the philosophy behind all three, but this time I want to get very specific and more practical about my personal favourite, which is shooting from the hip. Now, let me be clear about this, because there's a bit of a myth around it. Some people think that shooting from the hip is just kind of randomly pointing a camera at things and then hoping for the best, a sort of spray and pray approach, you know. It's absolutely not that. I think done properly, shooting from the hip street photography is a highly disciplined, deeply instinctive form of photography, and it demands that you develop a very particular set of skills to manage it. You need to know your camera so well that you can set it up without even looking. You need to develop, I guess, an almost sixth sense really for composition, visualizing what the lens is seeing even though your eye is nowhere near the viewfinder of the camera. You need to learn to stalk. And I use that word deliberately because you're moving through a street scene with purpose really and awareness, reading the light and the geometry around you. You're anticipating where that interesting moment is going to happen before it actually happens. And when you get it right, when you come home and pull up an image on your screen and you see something genuinely extraordinary that you barely even consciously took, there's no feeling quite like it in photography. I'm imagining that moment happening in a completely different context for us very soon, sitting in a motorhome somewhere in Portugal, say, laptop open, cup of coffee going cold, because I've been too absorbed in the images to even drink it. Now, Nina will find that an extremely familiar situation wherever we happen to be. But why hip shooting works, the kind of psychology behind it. Well, here's the thing about shooting from the hip that most other photography tutorials don't really talk about. And I think it's probably the most important thing about shooting from the hip. Because when people see a camera raised up to someone's eye, something happens, right? They change, they stiffen, they become aware of being observed. Even if they don't consciously react, there's a subtle shift, and that shift kills that authenticity in the moment. But when you're walking along with a camera hanging at your side or held loosely at hip height, you're invisible. You're just another person on the street. Nobody is performing for you. Nobody is trying to avoid you like the plague, right? Nobody's giving you a slightly self-conscious look that tells you that the moment that we're hoping for is already gone, right? Now, one of these things I've been thinking about a lot during this waiting period for us, while the house sale goes through and we research motorhomes, is how differently you experience a place when you arrive in a motorhome versus, of course, a hotel or an Airbnb. Now, every motorhome traveller that I've spoken to says the same thing. You arrive more slowly. You see the outskirts of the place before the centre of the place. You find your pitch and your campsite or your air. You make a cup of tea, you look out the window at whatever's there, and by the time that you pick up your camera and go for a walk, you already feel like you belong somewhere, rather than feeling like a visitor who's just been deposited in the middle of a tourist area. And that sense of belonging, that rather sort of unhurried feeling, I think is absolutely perfect for hip shooting, because hip shooting is, I think, 100% about being about blending in, shall we say. It's about being part of that street rather than just passing through the street. I genuinely cannot wait to find out what that combination feels like in practice as we travel. A few more months, hopefully the house viewings continue. Now let's talk kit, because gear choice really does matter here more than any other styles, I think. And there's an extra dimension to the gear conversation that I'm very much living right now, because we're selling up and paring down, and I've had to make some hard decisions about what photographic equipment actually comes with me when we eventually hit the road. Because let's face it, space in a motorhome, that's finite. I can't bring everything. And going through that process, deciding what is essential kit and what isn't, has actually been a really useful exercise in clarifying what I genuinely need versus what I've accumulated out of pure habit, and how many tens of thousands of pounds I've spent on that accumulation. For hip shooting specifically, the answer is reassuringly minimal. The ideal hip shooting camera is a small, light, quiet, with a wide lens. Now let me tell you why each of these things matter. I went back to one of my most groundbreaking cameras that I've ever bought, which is a Fuji X Pro 1, right? This is it here, right? It's a small rangefinder type camera which was released way back in 2012. And I bought one of the first cameras off the production line. It's in 2012. I got it in the second quarter of 2012 according to the serial number on it. And it's still in absolutely perfect condition. Autofocus is rubbish, right? The screen on the back is rubbish, and it's only 16 megapixels, but the sensor on it is astonishing. This was the first to use Fuji's own X-Trans sensor, which renders incredibly beautiful natural colours and sharpness in the images. Now, this is purely for me a street tool. My portraiture, however, demands another tool, which we're going to look at later in the series. Now, you can pick up these cameras second hand for a couple of £100. It's a bargain, trust me. Whatever camera you do use, it needs to be small and light, because you need to carry it comfortably at hip or waist height for extended periods. And even an iPhone makes a brilliant street camera, by the way. A big heavy camera, like one of these beasts here, on a long strap dangling at your side, is uncomfortable and obvious. Something compact that you can hold naturally and unobtrusively is really what you're after in this scenario, and something that won't take up half the limited storage space that we're going to have in whatever motorhome we end up choosing. Now, we're still researching that particular question quite extensively at the minute. It has to be quiet, by the way, ideally silent. Now, most mirrorless cameras have a silent electronic shutter mode. Use it. The last thing that you want is a loud mechanical click drawing attention to the fact that you're actually taking a picture of somebody without looking through the viewfinder. And the other thing is a wide lens. And this is fairly crucial. Now, when this camera first came out, it came with a 18mm, it came with a 35mm, and it came with a 60mm, and I bought the first two there, right? But I got the original 18 and I love it. I absolutely love it. It's a small pancake type lens. It's got a roughly like a 28mm and a normal 35mm full frame camera. And here's why that width matters for hip shooting specifically, because you know, you're not looking through the viewfinder. You need a wide field of view to ensure that your subject is actually in the frame. A telephoto lens at hip height shooting, like we would for shooting from hip, it's almost impossible to aim accurately. A wide angle is far more forgiving. And the other thing that I love about wide angle for this style of hip shooting that I do, right, is that it gives that slightly dramatic wide angle perspective. The way it includes the environment, the sky, the context around your subject, that gives hip shots images, I think, a real cinematic quality that I find really quite compelling. And I never crop these images, by the way. Whatever the frame is, that's the finished result. The odd elbow, knee, half a head at the edge of the frame, that's alright with me, because I think that only adds to the cinematic look that I'm looking for. And I often use the 16:9 ratio on my Fuji for exactly this reason, because it gives the final images that widescreen, almost movie still quality. Now try it, I think you'll be surprised. Let's talk a little bit about how to set up your camera. So this is where we get a little bit technical for a moment, so stick with me please. The fundamental challenge of hip shooting is that you're working, I think, constantly in changing conditions. You're moving from shade to sunlight, you're moving indoors to outdoors, you're moving crowded narrow little streets to big open squares, and you really don't have time to fiddle with settings between shots. You need a setup that handles the variables automatically, so you can concentrate entirely on where you're pointing the camera and when you're firing. This is something I'm particularly aware of, as I think ahead to kind of life on the road. One morning we might be parked up beside a fishing harbour in Portugal, and 3 days later we could be in the back streets of a Spanish market town. I need camera settings that are ready for anything, because the whole point of this adventure is that we don't entirely know where we're going to be from one week to the next. Now here is my, I guess, standard hip shooting setup. First of all, aperture priority. I set the aperture on the camera and I let the camera handle the shutter speed. Now for hip shooting, I want a small aperture. I want f11, f16, f22, because a deep depth of field means that everything from about a metre in front of me to infinity in the distance is sharp. Now sometimes, in fact I would probably say most times, I go fully manual. So first of all I set the aperture, let's say it's f16, and in fact I think it is on this camera because it's a very, it's actually built into the lens, so it's f16 is what I go to there. And I point the camera meter to a neutral grey area of pavement and set the shutter speed, and then that's it set. It's a great technique as I shoot RAW and JPEG. I can almost always sort the image in post-production afterwards if I've got the exposure wrong. And since I can't focus accurately without looking through the viewfinder, right, maximising that depth of field is my insurance policy. And I'm always on a high ISO. In bright European sunlight, that actually might mean ISO 400, and in a shaded narrow street somewhere I might push it to 3200, 6400 or even higher, because I would rather have grain than blur. In other words, picture power over pixel power every single time. Manual focus. Some photographers pre-focus to a fixed distance, maybe 2 or 3 meters, and rely on the depth of field to do the rest. And at f16 with a wide lens, almost everything will be acceptably sharp anyway. That's my method. Try it and see what works for you. And I always shoot RAW plus JPEG, always. Now I do this because the JPEG lets me review quickly on the back of the camera, with a histogram even, And I can even see it in black and white, giving me some approximation of what I'm looking for in my shot. And the RAW gives me the full latitude in post-production to then recover highlights, lift shadows, sort my exposure, convert to that high contrast black and white that I use and that I love for this style of work. So you can set this up in your camera before you go out. You can save them as a custom shooting mode if your camera allows that, and then you can forget about them. Your mind needs to be entirely on the street. So how do we actually do it? Well, okay, you've got your camera set up, you're on the street. Now what? Well, this is where I need to talk about something that sounds a little bit odd, but bear with me. You need to learn to see without looking. Now what do I mean by this? Well, I'm hip shooting. I'm not looking at my camera at all. I'm looking at the scene in front of me, to the left of me, to the right of me, in the distance. I'm looking at the people. I'm looking at the light. I'm looking at shapes. I'm looking at the movement in front of me. My camera is at my side or at my hip, and I'm using my peripheral vision and my spatial awareness, really, I guess, to judge where the lens is pointing. Now this takes practice, a fair bit of practice actually. When you start, your hit rate will be low. You'll come home with frames where the subject's half out of shot or the horizon's wildly tilted, or you've somehow managed to photograph your own foot. God, I've done that many times, we've all been there. But here's what happens as you develop that skill. You start to build a mental model of what your camera sees at hip height. You start to understand it. You learn to feel the angle of the lens. You develop an instinct for when to fire and when to wait. And gradually, not overnight, but gradually, your hit rate climbs. My technique is this. I walk slowly and with purpose. I don't dawdle, right? I'm not rushing. I'm scanning ahead. I'm looking for interesting faces. I'm looking for interesting light. I'm looking for interesting juxtapositions. And when I see something that interests me, I adjust my line of walking to bring the camera to the right position. I actually use my feet and my body to aim the shot rather than trying to angle the camera itself. And then I fire. Sometimes once, sometimes in a short burst. And then I keep walking. Smooth, unhurried, as if nothing had happened, because nothing did. As far as anyone around you is concerned, nothing happened at all. Now, one of the things that I'm most looking forward to about motorhome travel specifically is that unplanned stop. We're going to travel slow. We've already made that decision. This is an unhurried trip. The road that you turn down on a whim, the village that you spotted for the motorway, the harbour that you pulled into because you were going to just have a wee cup of tea and it looked right. These unplanned stops, from everything I've heard from experienced motorhome travellers, are often the best ones. Because what you're doing is you're arriving with absolutely no agenda. You've not got a shot list in mind. You've got no preconceptions. You just walk. And when you walk, you see things. And that's one of the things I'm most excited to discover for myself when we eventually get on that bloody road, which will happen eventually, as soon as somebody buys a house. Black and white, the natural home of hip photography. Yeah, I think the question of black and white versus colour is simple in this case. It's always black and white. Hip shot street images almost always work better than black and white. Not always, there is exceptions, of course there is, but as a default, monochrome is where I go first. And here's why. Because colour's distracting unless colour is the picture. When you're working from the hip, you've got an inherent rawness immediately to the images that you're shooting. If you introduce colour, that just adds another layer of information that can then pull the viewer's eye away from the thing that actually matters, which is the expression, the gesture, the moment, the light. Black and white strips all of that away. It reduces the image to its essential elements, I guess. Light, shadow, form, and humanity. And I think it suits the voyeuristic, documentary kind of quality of hip shooting perfectly. I'm already picturing the editing workflow on the road, laptop on whatever small table the motorhome turns out to have, Nina planning the next destination, a glass of something reasonable going through the day's images, that quiet evening rhythm of shooting and processing, moving and stopping. That's one of the things I'm genuinely most looking forward to about this whole adventure. I apply a high contrast black and white conversion in post that lifts the black slightly. It pulls the highlights down. Sometimes it adds a wee touch of grain to the image, and that reinforces, I think, that raw immediate feel. And if you shoot raw, of course, you've got complete control over the image afterwards in Lightroom or Capture One or whatever you may use. Try converting your colour hip shots to black and white and just see how many of them suddenly come alive. I think you'll surprise yourself. So that's shooting from the hip. It's the theory, it's the gear, it's the settings, and it's the technique. And if you're watching this as someone who's more interested, I guess, in the motorhome side of things, the motorhome adventure, rather than the photography side, thank you so much for sticking with me through, I guess, some technical stuff. I promise you that this channel is going to have tons and tons and tons of stuff for you. It's going to have the journey, it's going to have the locations, the motorhome search itself, Nina's thoughts on it all, because Nina's not appeared in any videos yet, but she will. And the honest reality of two people in the late 60s selling everything and starting again. All of that's coming. We're building towards it right now, in real time. And you're here from the very beginning. I think that's rather special, actually. The photography content, and there will be a lot of it, is really just the lens through which we're going to see Europe, literally and figuratively. In the next video in this series, we're moving on to what I think is the most challenging and the most personally rewarding style of street photography, and that is street portraiture. Walking up to complete strangers in the street and asking them to let you photograph them. I know, just the thought of it makes most photographers break out in a cold sweat. We're going to talk through the process about how exactly to do this, how to get over your fear, what to say, how to approach people, how to handle the rejection that you will get, and how to come away with images that genuinely take your breath away. And if that sounds like something you want to know more about, please hit subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. My name's Kenny Martin. This is Faces and Places Europe. And as always, get out there and shoot something, whether you're looking or not. Bye for now.